Welcome to this marketing automation demo. My name is Linus Hakason and I work as a solutions engineer in SnapLogic. In this demo, we will be having a look at how we can sync Marketo programs to Salesforce campaigns as well as the leads between them. So we will essentially be taking a look at two different use cases. The first is to sync Marketo programs into Salesforce campaigns. And also we will be syncing Marketo leads to Salesforce leads and also adding them as campaign members to those campaigns that have been created. This will be done through a batch process where we will pull Marketo for new programs based on a timestamp. We will then apply some filtering and provide some lead assignment, both provided by SnapLogic, but also by lead assignment rules in Salesforce. The other use case will be to stream in real time new incoming leads, both from Marketo as well as through other parties, such as from a REST API. Now, the cool thing here is that we will be taking advantage of the things that we have already built for the first use case, specifically creating leads from Marketo into Salesforce. This will also be a bidirectional sync, which means that when Marketo lead has come into Salesforce, we will respond back to the Marketo request with the Salesforce ID for that externally created lead reference. Now, as our first demonstration, we will be looking at syncing campaigns from Marketo programs to Salesforce campaigns. Now, the flow of the demo will be that automatically on a batch schedule, Marketo programs are being created into Salesforce campaigns. So a campaign is being created in Salesforce. The leads from Marketo are being created in Salesforce and also added as campaign members to the campaign in Salesforce. Now, the idea here is to have a kind of a separated lead assignment. So lead assignments will be done in SnapLogic based on some rules, but some lead assignments will be done in the assignment rules housed in Salesforce. Now, from a SnapLogic perspective, what we need to configure is obviously, first of all, making sure that we have access to the Marketo and Salesforce instances. And when we do, we want to pull Marketo for programs. We then want to create Salesforce campaigns for every program that we want to sync. And then when we have done that, we want to get the Marketo leads for that program and apply some lead assignment logic to who should be owning that leads in Salesforce, and then generate those leads in Salesforce. If they already exist, maybe for another campaign, we want not obviously creating them, but we will be looking them up instead and using their IDs as when they're adding as campaign members. So that's really the last part of the integration, to create those leads as campaign members to the Salesforce campaign. Now, as mentioned, we'll be doing this in a kind of a batch pull mechanism, which means that we will be having to manage timestamps to make sure that we're only getting the new unsynced campaigns, or rather programs, from Marketo. So let's start by having a look at how our Marketo setup looks like. So we have an Acme program creating in our active marketing programs folder, as well as an Acme customers list that we're looking at right now with some existing leads that are added to the program. We also have an Acme Smart campaign that we'll be coming to work with in the next demonstration. So here we have a couple of leads right here, and obviously we would like to sync both the program as a campaign in Salesforce as well as all the leads that you can see on the screen. So in Salesforce currently, there's no campaigns active when there's no leads in the leads database. So in SnapLogic, obviously the first thing we want to make sure is that we have a connection to both Salesforce and Marketo. To start with, what we can do is we can open our REST snap here to see that we're about to call out to the Marketo API to get all the programs. We can go into account and we can see that we have a Marketo dev instance right here that has all the required information for us in order to make a secure connection to Marketo. So the first thing we want to do is to call the get timestamp pipeline in order to retrieve a timestamp. So in SnapLogic, we have the pipeline execute snap that allows us to call reusable pipelines. In this case, we already have created one called Marketo get timestamp. We can see that we're passing a pipeline parameter to that pipeline. In this case, this parameter is called type, and we're passing the value programs. So if you just go into the Marketo get timestamp pipeline quickly, you can see it right here. It basically reads a file. So it assumes that we're going to read through a timestamp.json file that is prefixed with a type based on what the parent pipeline is calling in. So this pipeline has been set up with this type parameter that we referenced in our parent pipeline, and we've set the default value to being programs. Now, what that means is that we can reuse this pipeline for other type of polling mechanisms where we need a timestamp. So let's say that we want one for all the leads in the lead database. Then we could just reuse this and just pass leads rather than the program's timestamp. Now, similarly, if we go back to our first pipeline here, what we will be seeing is that at the end of our pipeline, we will be calling similarly another pipeline called Marketo update timestamp. And again, we're passing this program's parameter of a name type. So if we go into the Marketo update pipeline, we would see here that we're basically using a mapper snap to update the timestamp to the current date here using a JavaScript function. So we're saving that to the same JSON file for the program underscore timestamp.json in our case. And again, we can see here on the pipeline parameters that we're passing or that we're requiring a type parameter being passed. Now, after we've retrieved our timestamp, it's obviously then time to call out to Marketo. Now, we do that using, again, the REST snap to retrieve all the programs from Marketo, and we will get back a response that holds all the programs that we are looking at. So if we expand the entity here, we'll be seeing here that we only have one program currently set up in our Marketo environment. Now, obviously, that could be a multiple ones when we start to add more programs to Marketo. Then what we do is we use a JSON splitter just to make sure that we get that response sorted out as a list or a table rather of programs that we have. So here we can see in a table format or Acme program. Now, as we said, we want to only sync those programs that have been created or updated after our last sync. So we're using a filter snap. In the demo, I've said that the first expression needs to be true just to make sure that we always get true for our campaign here for demo purposes. But in reality, we would only use these two JavaScript functions right here. The first one will compare the Marketo programs created at date timestamp with the timestamp that we got back from our get timestamp pipeline to make sure that we're only syncing the relevant programs. We also, in this case, specifically checking the type of the Marketo program. So in this case, we're saying that we only want to sync programs from Marketo with the type event. Now, the next thing we do is, again, we use that pipeline execute snap in SnapLogic to create, or rather call out to a pipeline that we have already created. In this case, it's called O2 Salesforce create campaign. And what we're passing here is obviously the entire JSON object that we are sending into this input view. So again, that will be the entire campaign. We can just view that once again with all the different properties like the program, the ID, the created at date, the URL, what type of channel this program is, etc., etc. So we're passing all that through the body of the input view, and we're also passing a parameter just as we did with the timestamp parameters. So we're passing one called program ID with the ID of our actual Marketo program. So we explore that pipeline just quickly. We're going to see that we're using a record replace snap initially just to make sure that when we develop this pipeline, we have an example data to work with here. So again, if I open this output view open here, I will see exactly the same data here that we sent into the pipeline execute snap. Now, what we then do is we establish a connection to Salesforce. So obviously SnapLogic has a long list of snaps that we support. If I just turn and enter Salesforce, we'll be seeing a long list of Salesforce snaps that we support. In this case, I'm using the Salesforce create snap right here. And I've, just as I did with Marketo, I've configured an account. So this is what my Salesforce account looks like. Basically, it allows me to access my Salesforce instance. And then under settings, I basically said that I'm interested in creating campaigns in Salesforce. So all the objects here that are supported are coming from a list based on what my account is allowed to do in my particular instance. We will be seeing here that we have some custom objects created, but obviously the campaign one is kind of a standard object in Salesforce. Now, before we do that, we use a mapper snap. So a mapper snap in SnapLogic can be used to translate or transform between an input and a target schema. In our case, the input schema is the Marketo program information that we're passing into the pipeline. So the channel, the create that date, etc., etc. On the right-hand side, we can see the target schema. That is basically SnapLogic reading into our Salesforce Snap to understand what information is required in order to create that particular Salesforce object that we're trying to create. In this case, it's campaign. Now, this snap is probably the most used snap in SnapLogic. It provides a lot of cool stuff, for example, machine learning to automatically suggest to you a list of mappings between your input and target paths here. In this case, I just drag and drop. For example, here, if I wouldn't have done the channel yet, I could just drag and drop the channel across like this in order to map the channel in Marketo Program to the type in Salesforce. Now, as we're using JavaScript, we can do things like, for example, in Salesforce, we have a Boolean flag called isActive, but in Marketo, we have a status string called status. So here we're just turning this into a Boolean expression by comparing it to on, which would turn this on in Salesforce. I'm just going to discard that. So the next thing we want to do when we created the Salesforce campaign is get the Marketo leads. So just as we did with the programs, we're basically querying the API of Marketo, and in this case, dynamically passing that program ID where we want to retrieve the leads. So again, this underscore program ID references the program ID parameter that was sent to us by the previous pipeline. So if I can just go to the previous pipeline, I will see here that we are in the pipeline execute snap. We specify our Marketo program ID here in the program ID parameter. So if we just go back here, there's another thing we do as well. We specify in the fields query parameter that we want to pass the first name, or we want to get back rather, the first name, last name, company, title, email, country, and annual revenue from Marketo. So if you just go back to Marketo, we can see that that's information that we have available to us in our customer list right here. So when we have that information, we're basically, just as we did with programs, we're splitting that data out using the JSON splitter. So we get a nice little table view here of all the leads that we had in that Marketo program. So we can see here we have, for example, Earl Thompson, who is a manager of Fish Holdings, and he lives in the United Kingdom. Now, when we have that, we're going to call out to our third pipeline that is called Salesforce Create Leads. So basically how SnapLogic works is that when you use something like a pipeline execute, and for most of us snaps rather, we're looking at type of JSON object that you're passing into that snap's inputs view. Now, in this case, you can see here when we browse the JSON is that we have this array brackets right here that indicates that there's multiple rows or JSON objects rather in the array. Now, what SnapLogic will be doing is that for each of those objects in the top array, will be sent as separate JSON objects to the underlying pipeline in a pipeline execute snap. So that means that if we have 9 different JSON objects here, we will effectively call this other pipeline here 9 times. And what we can do is we can actually increase the performance here based on the infrastructure that we have provided SnapLogic with by adjusting the pool size. So basically by adjusting it to 10, we're basically saying that we want to in parallel execute all those 9, in this case 9, JSON objects in parallel. So if we just explore that final pipeline, we're going to have a look to see how we actually create the lead in Salesforce. So this is what the Salesforce Create Lead pipeline looks like. Again, we're using a record replace snap in order for us to have an example lead that is being passed through the pipeline in our development. So here we have again an example of such a lead. So what the first thing we're doing is we're going to check what the revenue is for that particular account or company for that lead using the router snap. So the router snap allows us to branch out the flow based on a particular expression. So here we're saying go to this SME flow for small companies if the annual revenue is more than 1 million, but actually go to the large flow here if the annual revenue is more than 5 million. So in our particular example here, we're going in this direction here. So we can see here that again, in that output preview, we have this lead. Now, the idea here is that we want to use the Salesforce lead assignment rules when we are dealing with SME companies. So here we're setting the owner assign flag to false. And in the other scenario where we actually have a large customer, we're basically using our conditional snap to specify what lead owner should be based on the country of that lead. So if the country is UK, then we're passing a particular Salesforce owner as the lead owner ID. If it's US, we're going to pass another as the lead owner ID, which is another Salesforce user. And obviously for that case, we're saying that the owner assigned flag is set to true rather than false. Then we're uniting the two flows together, and basically we're then mapping. So let's just close this down and see what we're mapping to. We're then using, again, the Salesforce create snap in order to create a lead this time rather than a campaign. And just as we did when we created a campaign, we're using a mapper to kind of translate between our input schema and the target schema. And here we can see that the owner assigned flag that we're setting to either true or false, depending on what type of flow we're taking, is reflecting to the assigned by SnapLogic custom field in the lead object. So if I just go into Salesforce, I'm going to have a look at my Salesforce housed lead assignment rules. So here I'm saying that, if the assigned by SnapLogic flag is set to false, which it will be for the, if I just come back here, for the top flow, then I want to, bottom flow, then I want to apply my Salesforce housed lead assignment logic. So here I'm saying that, if the country is UK, then assign this to Clara Gold. So this is a way to, combine both SnapLogic and Salesforce lead assignment rules based on certain criteria. Now, if we just look at some other parts of the mapping here, you can see we're mapping, the email, the first name, last name, company, etc., etc. Okay, so let's close that down. Now, what we're doing here is we're actually saying if we fail to create the lead in Salesforce, we want to look up that lead in Salesforce because most likely it already exists. So what SnapLogic allows you to do is not only in this view component here specify the number of input and output views. So you can see here for the union one, for example, we're using 2 input snaps. So that's all configurable for most of our snaps. You can also specify what should happen if there's an error in the pipeline on that particular snap. So in this case here of us already having the lead in Salesforce, we will be raising an error, or the snap will raise an error. And we're now saying specifically here that rather than just stopping the execution, we want to route that error data here to this flow right here. So then we're using the Salesforce lookup snap to look up that lead with that email for that lead, basically, because it should already exist. So whether it was just created or it already exists, we're going to get the ID of that lead that we're now going to add as the last step here to the Salesforce campaign as a Salesforce campaign member. So what we're doing is we're again using the Salesforce create snap. In this final case, we're using the campaign member object. And just as we have done before, we're using the mapper to translate between the input and target schemas. Now, in the case of creating a Salesforce campaign member, we need the status and the campaign ID as well as the lead ID. Now, the lead ID we have here from the lead that was either just created or just looked up in Salesforce. The campaign ID and the status here, we can see with the underscore that these are referenced as pipeline parameters. So campaign ID and status, we should have here as parameters in our pipeline. And if we go back to our pipeline execute snap, we will be seeing here that we actually passed the campaign ID and status from our previous pipeline. So that's essentially it. So now if this is scheduled, we can just go back to our main pipeline here. We can create a task. So a task is basically allowing SnapLogic to tell if we should automate and schedule the process of triggering this process or the pipeline, or we should expose it as an API, which we'll be doing in the next demonstration. Now, in this case, what we might have done is we might have created a schedule for executing this sync. Maybe we have said, for example, that we want this to run every Monday at 12 a.m., for example. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to go ahead and execute this pipeline like that. Now, again, what's going to happen is that we're going to pass the Marketo programs to Salesforce campaigns and also add members for them. So if you go to the dashboard of SnapLogic, what we will be seeing is how this execution is going. All right, so we can see that we have completed our Marketo get programs batch pipeline. Now this plus icon basically means that this pipeline called other pipelines using pipeline execute. So we can see that we call the Marketo get timestamp. We can see that then finally we call the Marketo update timestamp, but we also called this Salesforce create campaign pipeline. Now we can see as well that we have what is called an execution label here that says creating campaign for Acme program. So if we just go back to our pipeline here, we can see here that under the pipeline execute, we say as a label, creating campaign for $and name. That allows us to kind of get a visual overview of what's going on in our process. So if we just expand that one as well, we would assume that we have one Salesforce create leads pipeline being executed for each lead here in our Marketo program. So we say adding lead, and then we give you the details and the names of that person. So again, if I go to the other pipeline here, we should also see an execution label that represents that lead's first name and last name. Now, if I wanted to, I could understand what specifically goes on those individual lead creations by just opening up the details like this. I will be able to show and see, what snaps are doing, how many input and output documents it processes, if there's any errors, etc., etc. So just finally, what we'll be doing is we'll be going back into our Salesforce view here. And if I go now to campaigns, what I should be seeing is our Acme program with the trade show type listed here. And if I just go and have a look what that looks like, I should be seeing my 9 campaign members here. I can go and have a look specifically what they look like. So here we should be seeing kind of an identical list as we did back in our Marketo program list for the people right there. What we also can do is we can go in specifically to the leads and see what owners have been assigned to them. So we can see that some have been assigned to this Salesforce owner, some to this one, and some to this. So this is based of a combination of the SnapLogic and Salesforce applied lead assignment rules. So we now see how we can sync programs from Marketo to Salesforce campaigns. Now, what if there's a new lead update coming in from Marketo that we want to sync to Salesforce, or maybe there's an update or new lead coming in from another system like a REST API? Now, the idea here is to reuse some of the logic that we just looked at for the Marketo Salesforce sync. So in this flow, a new lead will be imported to Marketo Program, and then a Salesforce lead will be created in real time and added as a campaign member to the Salesforce campaign. Now, what we will do in SnapLogic is we'll be setting up a pipeline that accepts incoming customer data and the name of that Marketo program. We'll then use a Salesforce lookup snap to check for the campaign ID based on the name in the Marketo program. We'll then reuse and execute using a pipeline execute snap that Salesforce create leads pipeline that we just used. We will expose our pipeline as a triggered task, which means that we can basically call it from another service using a REST API. In our case, we will set up Marketo to send requests to our triggered tasks through our webhook. So in this pipeline, what the goal is to accept incoming customer data with an Acme program name from Marketo. We want to then filter out to make sure that the lead is supposed to be created in Salesforce. We will then look up the Salesforce program or campaign based on a Marketo program name, and we will then call out using a pipeline execute snap to the reusable pipeline. So if we start here on the left-hand side, first of all, we use a JSON parser to accept the incoming binary document from Marketo or from an API that could be the customer information needed in order to create a lead in Salesforce. We're then using a filter snap to make sure that that program contains the name Acme. So in this case, we just have an example filter here to filter out some of the program lead updates that we're not necessarily interested in. Then what we do is we use the Salesforce lookup snap, specifically asking for campaigns where the name equals the program name in Marketo. As we already have the sync happened and a new campaign has been created in Salesforce with the same name as a program in Marketo, we should now get back a response here from Salesforce using this lookup. Specifically, we're only after the ID here of that particular campaign. So if you just look at the output of the Salesforce lookup response, what we should be seeing is just that ID of that newly created Salesforce campaign. So in the mapper snap, what we're doing is we're basically just saying that, let's keep all our customer data fields that are coming in from Marketo or from the REST API, but let's remove them from this original flag and pass them in as the entire kind of data structure on the root level, along with the ID here. So we use the extend function in JavaScript to add the ID parameter to our JSON object. So now we will have all the email, the first name, as well as the ID as well. Now, just as we did for our previous demo, we're going to be using a pipeline execute snap to go to our Salesforce create leads pipeline. So just as a refresher, the Salesforce create lead pipeline basically allowed us to look up or create a new lead in Salesforce, as well as adding them as a campaign member. So the idea here is to reuse this pipeline from the incoming updates pipeline. So again, we're using a pipeline execute snap where we specify that pipeline, and then we're adding an execution label, as well as setting the campaign ID and status pipeline parameters. And then finally, we're going to get a response back from our Salesforce create lead pipeline. The response will be the newly created lead in Salesforce, or specifically the ID. So the idea of this is to post back to the caller, whether it's Marketo or the REST API, we're going to call back with the newly created Salesforce ID. So we're using the mapper snap here to basically respond in the Salesforce lead URL data here. We're having the Salesforce URL plus the lead ID that comes from our kind of child pipeline, as we call it here. So what we've been doing is we've been exposing this as a task, just as we did for scheduling the campaign sync. We can also create a triggered task that basically allows us to call this pipeline through an API. So we created a triggered task here. This will give us a URL. So if we go into the manager of SnapLogic, we can see that particular triggered task URL right here, as well as a bearer token. Now what we've done in Marketo is we went in and configured a webhook configuration in integration page. So here we have that particular endpoint, as well as the payload of the data that we need to pass to our SnapLogic pipeline from Marketo. So this includes everything from the email to the country and the company of the lead. Now, what we've also done is in the response mapping of Marketo, we've said that when we get a response back from that webhook, we want to look at the Salesforce lead URL response attribute in the incoming data and add that to our Salesforce lead URL custom object on our Marketo lead. So with that, if we now go into Marketo and just import a new person here into our program list, we will then be seeing how we can use that webhook to reflect those changes. So we're just going to select the default mapping of the Marketo CSV file. We're going to select our program right here. And now we will be adding, if we go back to our people list here, we should be starting to see a new person coming on, who is called John Smith. So you can see John Smith coming on right here as the new added lead. Now, if we go back to SnapLogic, what we should be seeing here in the dashboard is this incoming update pipeline. And again, this plus icon means that this pipeline calls another one, which in this case is the reusable Salesforce create leads one. So we're adding another lead for John Smith here. So if I go back into Salesforce and I just refresh here, let me go back to my campaign. And again, let me go into that Acme program. Now, what I should be seeing really is 10 campaign members rather than 9. So now we also have John Smith here. Now, as this is a final demonstration, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call that same webhook, that same triggered task through Postman. In this case, I'm adding the status as responded right here. So if I just go back to my pipeline, I can see here that I've exposed this pipeline parameter called status. And I'm using that to call out, to forward that parameter rather, to the Salesforce create leads pipeline so that we get a new lead status for that particular lead that we now make an update to. So we're creating a new lead here called Manuel Hartman. I'm keeping this data here default, and I'm just gonna send that through. So as we can see, whether we're calling from Marketo or we're calling from a REST API, we will be creating a lead in Salesforce and responding back with the Salesforce lead URL that we got back here by creating this mapper response. So if I just first go back to our Marketo table and I go into John Smith, what I actually should be seeing for the details in Marketo for John Smith is those actual that actual Salesforce lead URL. And if I just copy and paste that one, I should be coming to that newly created lead for John Smith. Now, if I just go back to my list of leads and I hit refresh, I should also be seeing now the new Manuel Hartman with the new status called responded. So that should give you an introduction on how we can integrate Marketo with Salesforce, and specifically how we can sync campaigns and programs between the two instances. Now, specifically what we also did is we reused a pipeline across two of our use cases, as well as using a triggered task that exposed one of our pipelines to use a Marketo webhook functionality, as well as a REST API simulation through Postman. So thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.